Did you really think I wouldn't accept your invitation, Gary? The question sliced through the champagne-soaked chatter like a knife through silk, my voice carrying across the terrace with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you've already won. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. And in that perfect crystalline moment of silence, I watched understanding dawn on my ex-husband's face, like a sunrise he desperately didn't want to see. Behind me, the emerald green Rolls Royce sat gleaming in the evening light, its doors still open, revealing the interior like a stage curtain pulled back on the final act. 4 children in coordinated formal wear stepped out with careful precision, 3 girls in cream dresses with delicate embroidery, 1 boy in navy suit with bow tied perfectly tied. Their tiny hands were held by my husband David and our nannies, but their eyes, bright and curious, took in the mansion and the crowd felt, with the fearless wonder of toddlers who have no idea they've just become the most devastating statement their mother will ever make. I watched the color drain from Gary Roberts' face in real time, watched his expressions cycle through confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like physical pain. His young wife Jessica stood beside him, 6 months pregnant with what he'd been calling his first child, her champagne glass trembling so violently in her hand that golden liquid sloshed over the rim and onto her pink dress. She gripped Gary's arm like it was the only thing keeping her upright. And maybe it was because the math wasn't mathing and everyone on that terrace was doing the same calculation at the same time. This is for you. If you've ever been made to feel like you weren't enough, if someone ever measured your worth by what you couldn't give them, if anyone ever looked you in the eye and called you incomplete, broken, insufficient, this moment right here is for you. Because 3 years ago, Gary Roberts stood in front of his entire family and told me I was biologically incomplete, that I could never give him what mattered, that he needed a real wife who could actually complete his family. He handed me divorce papers at a family dinner like I was a failed business investment, discarded me like defective merchandise, and rewrote our entire marriage as his noble sacrifice, putting up with a woman who simply couldn't deliver. But here's what Gary didn't know. What he couldn't have known as he sent that cruel invitation to his baby announcement party. Sometimes the cruelest verdicts are also the most wrong, and sometimes the universe has a sense of poetic justice that no screenwriter could ever dream up. Let me tell you exactly how we got here. 3 years before that emerald Rolls Royce pulled up to Gary's celebration, Helen Roberts lived in a different world entirely. The penthouse overlooking the city skyline, the reserved table at the country club where waiters knew her name, the hot charity galas where photographers captured her and Gary with champagne glasses raised, smiling like they'd invented happiness itself. She wore designer gowns that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And when she walked into a room on Gary's arm, conversations paused just long enough to acknowledge their presence. They were the couple other couples wanted to be, the marriage that looked like it had been designed by architects rather than built by 2 people learning to love each other. But behind the crystal chandeliers and marble countertops, something was shifting. The doctor appointments started as hopeful adventures, exciting planning sessions for the family they were going to build. Helen remembered laughing in the waiting room, squeezing Gary's hand, whispering about baby names and nursery colors. But month after month, the pregnancy tests stayed negative. The appointments became quieter. Gary stopped holding her hand in the waiting rooms. His questions to the doctors grew sharper, more clinical, like he was troubleshooting a business problem rather than navigating their shared disappointment. The pressure arrived slowly, then all at once. Gary's mother started making comments about continuing the family legacy at Sunday dinners. His business partners asked when they'd be hearing pitter-patter of little feet. And every time someone asked, Helen watched Gary's jaw tighten just slightly, saw the way he'd glance at her like she was a project that wasn't delivering expected returns. The warmth in his eyes, the affection that used to light up when he looked at her, it started flickering like a candle running out of oxygen. Their intimacy transformed from something tender into something that felt like a scheduled obligation, another item on Gary's to-do list. He'd check his watch afterward. He'd ask if she'd taken her vitamins, adjusted her diet, followed the doctor's instructions to the letter. His touch became transactional. His concern felt more like quality control than love. Helen started feeling less like a wife and more like a failing investment, something Gary had poured resources into that simply wasn't performing as projected. She remembered the exact moment she saw it in his eyes, that cold calculation replacing whatever affection had once lived there. They were getting ready for another gala, and she'd caught him staring at her in the mirror, not with desire or even frustration, but with something far worse. Assessment. Like he was running numbers in his head, weighing options, calculating cost-benefit analyses. But Gary's patience was running out, and what he said next would destroy everything. The invitation to dinner at Gary's parents' estate came on a Tuesday. Helen assumed it was just another obligatory family gathering, the kind they'd attended dozens of times before. She wore a cream-colored dress, brought the wine Gary's mother preferred, even practiced small talk in the car about quarterly earnings and the new golf course development. Gary seemed unusually quiet during the drive, but she attributed it to work stress. She had no idea she was being driven to her own execution. The dining room was set beautifully, as always. Crystal gleamed under the chandelier. Gary's parents sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, their faces carefully neutral in a way that should have warned her. Gary's brother and sister-in-law were there too, both suddenly fascinated by their napkins. The first course was served. Polite conversation about weather and stock markets filled the space between the clink of silverware on china. Helen was halfway through her soup when Gary set down his spoon with deliberate precision. "I've asked everyone here tonight because I have an announcement to make." His voice carried that boardroom authority, the tone he used when closing deals. Helen looked up, confused, maybe even hopeful for a split second that this was something positive. "Helen and I are getting divorced." The room went silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Helen's spoon clattered against her bowl. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Gary continued as if he were presenting a quarterly report, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, never quite meeting her gaze. "I built an empire. I need a wife who can actually complete our family, not someone who's biologically incomplete." Each word landed like a physical blow. Biologically incomplete. He said it in front of his parents, his siblings, as casually as he might comment on the weather. "I've been patient, I've given this every opportunity, but I can't spend the rest of my life with someone who can't give me the one thing that actually matters." Helen's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor herself to something solid, while her entire world collapsed. And then she saw him, a man in a dark suit standing in the doorway. Gary nodded to him, and the man approached with a leather portfolio, placing it on the table in front of Helen with practiced efficiency. "My attorney has prepared everything," Gary said, his tone businesslike, almost bored. "You'll find the terms more than fair. I'm not a cruel man, Helen. I'm just being honest about what I need." The papers sat there, already signed by Gary, dated from 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. He'd been planning this, orchestrating this public humiliation while she'd been picking out wine and practicing small talk. The lawyer produced a pen, set it down next to the portfolio like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Helen stood slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room watched her, some with pity, some with uncomfortable relief that this awkwardness would soon be over. She didn't look at the papers, didn't touch the pen. She simply picked up her purse, held her head high, and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Gary's mother whisper something, heard the lawyer clear his throat, heard the clock continue its relentless ticking. She didn't cry until she was in her car. She didn't scream until she was on the highway. And she didn't let herself completely shatter until she was alone in the penthouse that would soon belong only to him. Helen walked out of that house thinking she'd lost everything. She had no idea that night was just the beginning of her nightmare. The modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she'd never even driven through felt like a prison sentence after the penthouse. Helen stood in the empty living room on her first night, staring at bare walls that seemed to close in around her, listening to sounds she'd never noticed before. Neighbors arguing through thin walls, traffic noise from the street below, the hum of a refrigerator that wasn't new enough to stay quiet. She'd gone from marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, to laminate counters and a view of a parking lot. Every corner of this small space whispered the same message Gary had delivered at that dinner table. "You failed. You weren't enough. This is what you're worth now." The social exile happened faster than she'd imagined possible. Phone calls to friends went unanswered. Text messages received one-word replies that felt like doors slamming shut. The women she'd shared champagne brunches with, The couples they'd vacationed with in the Hamptons, they all vanished like morning fog. At first, Helen told herself they were just uncomfortable, unsure what to say. But then she saw the Instagram photos from events she used to attend. The same faces laughing at the same tables, just without her in the frame. She'd been erased from her own social circle as efficiently as her name had been removed from the country club membership. The whispers followed her everywhere. She heard them at the grocery store, caught fragments at the coffee shop, saw the pitying glances from women who used to air-kiss her cheeks at charity galas. That's her, the one who couldn't give him children. I heard she was completely infertile. Gary had no choice, really. What else was he supposed to do? The story had been rewritten with Gary as the victim, a successful man who'd made the difficult but necessary decision to move on from a defective wife. Helen had become a cautionary tale, a label rather than a person. The ex-wife who couldn't give him children. 6 words that erased everything else she'd ever been. The sleepless nights were the worst. 3 a.m. became her most honest hour, when she couldn't hide behind daytime distractions or forced optimism. She'd lie in the dark of that unfamiliar bedroom, replaying Gary's words on an endless loop. Biologically incomplete. Maybe he was right. Maybe something fundamental was broken inside her. Maybe her worth really could be measured by her fertility. And by that metric, she'd failed the only test that mattered. Some mornings she could barely get out of bed. Some days she couldn't remember why she should bother trying. Helen was drowning. But sometimes, the universe sends a lifeline exactly when you've stopped looking for one. Helen started volunteering at a children's art charity 6 months after the divorce, not because she'd found some renewed sense of purpose, but because she needed to leave her apartment before the walls finished closing in. She figured she could at least be useful, even if she couldn't be whole. The fundraiser that evening was small, nothing like the glittering galas she used to attend. Folding tables instead of linen tablecloths, donated wine instead of vintage champagne, people in business casual instead of designer gowns. She was arranging auction items when a voice behind her said, "That Rothko print should be positioned higher. The lighting will catch it better, make the reds more dramatic." She turned to find a man in a simple navy suit, salt and pepper hair, kind eyes that actually looked at her face instead of cataloging her failures. "You know Rothko?" she asked, surprised. He smiled. "I know good art when I see it, and I know when someone's arranging a display with actual understanding instead of just making things look pretty." They talked for 20 minutes about color theory and composition, about emerging artists, and the democratization of art education. He never once asked her last name, never tried to place her in some social hierarchy. He just listened to her ideas like they mattered. His name was David Walker. He was a businessman, successful but not showy about it, more interested in substance than status. Over the next few months, they kept running into each other at charity events, started meeting for coffee to discuss fundraising strategies, then dinners that had nothing to do with charity work at all. He made her laugh. He asked her opinions on things that had nothing to do with her ability to produce children. When he looked at her, she felt like a person again, not a diagnosis or a disappointment. 3 months into whatever they were building, Helen knew she had to tell him. They were having dinner at a quiet bistro when she set down her wine glass and forced the words out. "I need you to know something about me. I can't have children, or I haven't been able to. The doctors say it's unlikely I ever will." Her hands were shaking. She braced herself for the familiar retreat, the cooling of interest, the careful extraction that men perform when a woman reveals she's broken in the way that matters most. David reached across the table and took her hand. "Helen, that doesn't define who you are. Nothing about you is incomplete." The simplicity of it, the absolute certainty in his voice, cracked something open inside her chest. "I'm interested in you, the woman who lights up talking about art education, the person who remembers everyone's coffee order at volunteer meetings, the brilliant mind I get to have dinner with." He squeezed her hand gently. "Everything else, we figure out together. If we want children, there are paths. If we don't, there are paths. But none of those paths change who you are." For the first time in years, Helen felt seen, but she had no idea just how completely her life was about to transform. Helen launched her art consulting firm 18 months after meeting David, working out of a small office that overlooked a park instead of a skyline. She specialized in helping emerging artists navigate galleries and collectors, in making the art world accessible rather than exclusive. The work filled her in ways the charity luncheons and country club committees never had. These were her ideas, her expertise, her vision bringing beauty into the world. When clients thanked her for changing their careers, for believing in their talent when no one else would, she realized she'd built something that had nothing to do with who she'd married and everything to do with who she actually was. David proposed on a Tuesday evening in her office. No dramatic restaurant or orchestrated moment. Just him walking in with takeout and a ring, saying he wanted to spend every Tuesday evening for the rest of his life exactly like this. Their wedding was small, intimate, held in a garden with 50 people who actually knew them rather than 300 acquaintances trying to network. When Helen walked down the aisle, David's eyes filled with tears, and she knew with absolute certainty that this man saw her, all of her, not some idealized version or potential baby-making vessel. He saw Helen and loved exactly what he found. They'd been married 8 months when Helen brought up the possibility of trying one more time. She needed David to understand it wasn't about proving anything, wasn't about erasing the past or validating her worth. "I just want to know I tried everything," she said quietly. "Not because I need to be a mother to be complete, but because I want to be a mother with you. If it doesn't happen, we'll adopt, we'll foster, we'll be the cool aunt and uncle. But I need to try one more time without it defining whether I'm enough." David kissed her forehead. "Then we try. Together, no pressure, no timelines, no measuring your worth by an outcome." The fertility treatments were different this time. No tension, no silent car rides, no feeling like a failed experiment. Just two people showing up for each other, hoping but not desperate, wanting but not shattered by the possibility of loss. Helen had almost forgotten about the blood work when her phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. The nurse's voice sounded strange, careful, like she was choosing each word with precision. "Mrs. Walker, I need you to sit down." Helen's heart dropped. This was it, the kind but gentle letdown. The confirmation that some things just weren't meant to be. "You're pregnant, and according to the ultrasound, you're carrying quadruplets, 4 healthy heartbeats." Helen sat in her office, phone pressed to her ear, laughing and crying at the same time, thinking about Gary's words at that family dinner, biologically incomplete. She'd just been given 4 times the miracle he'd claimed she'd never have. Helen had everything Gary said she'd never have. And then the envelope arrived. The cream-colored envelope arrived on a Saturday morning, expensive cardstock that Helen recognized immediately as the kind Gary had always preferred for important announcements. Her name was written in his distinctive handwriting, bold and self-assured, the letters precisely formed like everything else he did. She stared at it for a full minute before opening it, her coffee going cold on the kitchen counter, some instinct warning her that whatever was inside would matter. The invitation was elegant, engraved, announcing a celebration for Gary Roberts and his wife Jessica to reveal the gender of their expected child. Black tie optional, cocktails at 7, RSVP requested. But it was the handwritten note tucked inside that made Helen's hands start shaking. "Thought you'd want to celebrate what a real family looks like. No hard feelings, minus G, no hard feelings." As if he hadn't publicly destroyed her, hadn't called her biologically incomplete in front of his entire family, hadn't rewritten their entire marriage as his noble sacrifice, enduring a defective wife. The rage came fast and hot. 3 years of carefully constructed healing threatening to crack open. Helen paced her kitchen, the invitation crumpled in her fist, feeling every old wound tear open fresh. He was doing this deliberately, calculatedly, throwing his victory in her face while she was 7 months pregnant with quadruplets he knew nothing about. The cruelty of it, the casual malice wrapped in fancy paper and polite phrasing, made her want to scream. He wanted her to know she'd been replaced, upgraded, that his new wife could deliver what Helen never could. He wanted her to feel small and broken and incomplete all over again. David found her 20 minutes later, still pacing, still furious, the invitation now torn into careful pieces on the counter. He read the fragments, his jaw tightening, but his voice stayed calm. "He's trying to hurt you because he knows he lost. Men like Gary don't send invitations like this from a place of happiness. They send them from insecurity." He gathered the pieces, dropped them in the trash, then took Helen's hands. "You have a choice here. You can ignore this, which is what he deserves. Or you can show him that his judgment means absolutely nothing, not because you need to prove anything to him, but because you need to prove something to yourself. Helen looked down at her rounded belly, felt the 4 lives moving inside her, thought about the business she'd built and the man standing in front of her who'd never once measured her worth by what her body could produce. Gary's invitation wasn't about celebration, it was about power, about making sure she knew her place in his story, but she was writing a different story now, one where his opinion was completely irrelevant to her happiness. Helen made her decision, and what she did next would become legendary. Helen stood in front of her closet the morning of Gary's party, running her fingers along fabric, considering and rejecting option after option. This wasn't about making a statement or declaring war. It was about walking back into a room where she'd once been measured and found wanting, and proving to herself that his measurement had been worthless all along. She needed closure, the kind that only comes from facing the person who tried to break you and realizing they no longer have any power over who you've become. The powder blue gown had been hanging in the back of her closet, still wrapped in tissue from the boutique. She'd bought it months ago for a gallery opening, soft silk that draped elegantly over her post-pregnancy figure, sophisticated without trying too hard. When she slipped it on, the woman looking back from the mirror wasn't trying to compete or impress. She was simply Helen Walker, successful, loved, complete in ways that had nothing to do with Gary's opinion. Dressing the quadruplets took patience and David's help. 3 girls in cream dresses with delicate embroidery, 1 boy in tiny navy suit with bow tie that kept coming undone. They were 18 months old, just starting to form words, completely unaware that they were about to become the most powerful statement their mother would ever make. Not because she was using them as weapons, but because they were living proof that sometimes the cruelest verdicts are also the most wrong. David adjusted his own tie in the mirror, then turned to Helen, his expression serious. I need you to remember something tonight. You're not walking into that party to prove anything to Gary Roberts. You're not showing him that he was wrong about you because his judgment was never valid in the first place. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. You're showing him what he lost. Not your fertility, not your ability to have children. He lost you, your intelligence, your grace, your capacity to love someone completely. That's what he traded away when he decided your worth could be measured by biology. Helen felt something settle inside her chest, a calm certainty replacing the nervous energy that had been building all week. She wasn't going to Gary's party for revenge. Revenge required caring what he thought, needing his validation or his regret. She was going because she needed to stand in that space where he'd once made her feel small and realize she'd outgrown his ability to hurt her. The emerald green Rolls Royce, borrowed from David's business partner for the evening, waited in the driveway. Helen buckled the children into their car seats, kissed David, and took a deep breath. The night arrived, and as Helen's car pulled up to that mansion, every eye turned toward her. The emerald Rolls Royce glided to a stop in front of the mansion's circular driveway, and Helen watched through the tinted windows as conversations on the terrace stuttered to a halt. Champagne glasses paused mid-sip. Heads turned in synchronized curiosity. The valet approached, opened her door, and Helen stepped out in her powder blue gown, the evening light catching the silk just right. She moved with unhurried grace, taking her time, letting the moment breathe. Then David opened the rear passenger door, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. 4 toddlers emerged in coordinated elegance, the girls in their cream dresses, the boy in navy suit, each one held carefully as they navigated the steps. The collective gasp from the terrace was audible even from the driveway. Helen watched faces transform, watched the mental math happening in real time as guests who remembered the divorce, who'd whispered about the woman who couldn't give Gary children, suddenly confronted impossible arithmetic. She found Gary immediately. He was standing near the champagne fountain, his young wife Jessica beside him in a pink dress stretched over her 6-month baby bump, both of them frozen like someone had pressed pause on their celebration. The color drained from Gary's face in stages. Confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked almost like panic. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Jessica's champagne glass trembled in her hand, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Helen walked toward them, David at her side, the children following with the nannies they'd brought for support. Every step across that terrace felt like walking through water, guests parting to let her pass, whispers erupting in her wake. She stopped directly in front of Gary, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to watch his eyes dart between her face and the 4 children now arranged behind her, like living proof of his greatest miscalculation. "Congratulations on your first child, Gary." Her voice was steady, warm even, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "I hope you're better at fatherhood this time around." The silence that followed was exquisite. Gary's mouth worked soundlessly, his carefully cultivated composure completely shattered. Jessica gripped his arm, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning humiliation as she realized what everyone else was realizing. This was the ex-wife Gary had called biologically incomplete. This was the woman he'd publicly divorced for failing to give him children. And she was standing in front of him with quadruplets, glowing with the kind of happiness that can't be faked, married to a man whose hand rested protectively on her back with genuine affection. The whispers started immediately, no longer sympathetic to Gary's narrative. He said she couldn't have children. 4, she has 4. Did you hear what he called her? God, how embarrassing for him. Helen watched Gary's social capital evaporate in real time, watched his moment of triumph curdle into his most public humiliation. But Helen wasn't finished. What she did next showed everyone the difference between revenge and grace. Helen could have stayed. She could have worked the crowd, accepted the congratulations already starting to flow her way, let Gary squirm under the weight of his own cruelty now made visible to everyone who'd witnessed it. But that would have made this about him, about proving something, about forcing him to acknowledge his mistake. And Helen had learned something crucial in the 3 years since that family dinner. Gary's acknowledgement was worthless currency. His opinion had never been the measure of her worth, and his regret wouldn't add a single ounce of value to the life she'd built. She turned to leave, David already gathering the children, when she caught Jessica's eye. The younger woman looked lost, trapped between her husband's humiliation and her own dawning understanding of what kind of man she'd married. Helen paused, stepped closer, her voice low enough that only Jessica could hear. "I hope he treats you better than he treated me." It wasn't a threat or a warning, just a simple truth offered from one woman to another. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and Helen saw recognition there, the kind that comes when someone shows you grace you didn't know you needed. The drive home was everything the party wasn't. The children sang nonsense songs in their car seats, competing to see who could be loudest, their laughter filling the car with pure, uncomplicated joy. David reached over and squeezed Helen's hand, and she realized she was smiling, genuinely smiling, not from triumph or vindication, but from contentment. The emerald Rolls Royce carried them away from Gary's mansion, away from the whispers and the shocked faces, back toward the life that had nothing to do with him at all. Helen stared out the window at the passing streetlights, her children's voices washing over her, and felt something shift into final alignment. She'd walked into that party thinking she needed Gary to see what he'd lost, needed him to understand how wrong he'd been. But sitting here now, surrounded by her actual family, she realized the truth. Gary's opinion didn't matter. It had never mattered. He'd measured her worth by a single metric and found her wanting, but his measurement system had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. She wasn't incomplete then, and his verdict hadn't made her so. She'd always been whole. She just needed to find people who could see it. The true victory wasn't the look on Gary's face or the whispers turning against him. It was this moment, this car ride, this ordinary, perfect evening with people who loved her completely. It was building a business on her own terms, finding partnership instead of ownership, creating a family built on respect instead of transactions. Gary had tried to define her by what she couldn't give him, but Helen had defined herself by what she could create, and that turned out to be everything. If Helen's story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated or discarded, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the best revenge is a life well lived. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.